A Teasing Courtship, a Pride and Prejudice variation by Cowrie Fish. Chapter 1, A Devious Acceptance. Darcy's words were as passionate as they were unexpected as he stood before Elizabeth in the parsonage library. You must allow me to tell you how ardently I admire and love you. Her silence gave him leave to continue, and as he did, she could only think of how certain he seemed to be. He truly wanted her for his own. She never expected to have such power over him, and the possibilities distracted her from his discourse upon her family. What better way to right his wrongs than by giving him what he asked for and allowing him to pay his addresses? She half suspected that he asked only to be refused, but she would not grant him that release. No, she would consent. Then would she make him run the gauntlet of a long courtship. Jane would surely meet with his friend again. She could make him do right by Mr. Wickham. She would witness his humiliation at the prospect of taking her family as his own. The possibilities were delightfully endless. As tempting as it was to refuse the infuriating man what he wanted, or what he thought he wanted, there was much more sport in accepting him. That she would end their attachment before allowing it to become an engagement, she did not question. Yes, she said. He hardly seemed to hear her, so bent was he on belittling her family. He looked at her in surprise. I beg your pardon, he said. I said, yes, you may court me, she replied. He staggered, to her delight. This proof that her response was not to his expectation thrilled her. Oh, perhaps you are not being sincere in your declaration, she said, deliberately looking down in an attitude of timidity. Immediately he was before her, pressing her hand and speaking of his sincerity. Could you look into my heart, you would not doubt the affection I hold for you, Miss Elizabeth, he said earnestly. It is only that you seemed so surprised when I said you might pay me your addresses, she said demurely. Surely King Cophetua did not expect his beggar maid to send him back to his palace with a hearty no. Strongly did he reject the comparison, then moved to kiss her. She moved back with a modest reluctance. Have you obtained the blessing of my cousin, Mr. Collins? She asked. Darcy started. That vicar? He asked, barely civilly. Yes, he is to inherit Longbourn, she said, exulting at the thought of Darcy tormented by being connected with a man he so obviously loathed. You care for his approval? He asked, disbelieving. As I am beneath his roof and protection, is it not most suitable for you to seek his permission to pay your addresses? I will not return home for near a month yet, where you might apply to my father for his consent to court me. She gazed at him furtively while she spoke, gratified to see color chase over his countenance as he took in her meaning. Of course, I shall do so directly, he said. Is he yet at Rosings? If so, you might seek your aunt's approval at the same time, she suggested. Darcy paled, which she pretended to ignore in gazing at her shoes. Incoherently he took his leave, which she accepted with appropriate shyness. Then he was walking back to Rosings. She watched through the window, exulting at the tortures that she had already been able to inflict on the insufferable man. However long she could draw this out, she would. Darcy's mind raced disjointedly as he strode. His brief joy that she had accepted him was now overwhelmed by the obstacles in the way of their union. He had hoped he might at least be allowed to kiss her. He had decidedly not thought about his aunt's reaction to their engagement when he sought Elizabeth's hand, and the notion of applying to the ridiculous Mr. Collins for anything offended him painfully. But just as his legs carried him to the parsonage to propose, despite his rational objections, they carried him to Rosings' drawing-room to face Lady Catherine and her protégé. Fortunately, he found his cousin lingering in the hallway. Darcy could tell he desired the tea within, but not the company. George, might I speak with you? Darcy asked. Surprised to be asked so humbly, as his cousin tended to state his requests as demands, Colonel Fitzwilliam rapidly acquiesced, and the two men sought the parlor. I offered for Miss Elizabeth, and she has accepted me, Darcy began, leaping lightly over the matter of her conditional consent to being courted. Fitzwilliam stared in astonishment. I suspected that you liked her, but to marry with her, he responded. This I never expected. Surely I seem too besotted with my own pride to see what a jewel she is, Darcy replied, but my regard was stronger than my reservations. A jewel indeed, Fitzwilliam said, thinking of his own conversation with her that morning. He said nothing, knowing how jealous a man new in love might be. She wishes me to seek the approval of Mr. Collins and my aunt, Darcy admitted. Her discretion does her judgment credit, Fitzwilliam observed. I know you will want Georgiana to behave thus, once she comes of age. This hit home. His sister would be guided by his wife's example. How could he cause her to behave with anything but the utmost seemliness? But Collins is insufferable. In Hertfordshire, the man sought me out to intrude his acquaintance upon me, unintroduced, Darcy said. He is awful, is he not? Fitzwilliam agreed. Yet she is his guest, and he shall be her guardian, I believe, should her father die before she attains her majority, which I gather is something more than a year in the future. Darcy blinked. He had not considered her youth. That he did not know her age struck him as one of the many things he did not know about Elizabeth. But he persisted in his line of complaint. And you know how unpleasant Aunt Catherine will be, both to me and undoubtedly to her, once she knows, Darcy said. I certainly wouldn't brace them at the same time, his cousin advised. Divide and conquer. First her, then him. You know he will cede anything she has deemed acceptable. But if he returns to the parsonage without my having asked him, she will discover it, Darcy objected. I see Miss Elizabeth already has you quite in hand, Fitzwilliam replied. I could delay him until you have spoken with Aunt Catherine. His wife is with them, which will make the job less tedious. Very well, Darcy said, rising and setting out on a hopeless charge. Fortunately, when Darcy entered, the Collinses were making their farewells, so obsequiously that it made Darcy wish to grit his teeth. He greeted them in passing as they left, then approached his aunt. Lady Catherine, I wish to make a disclosure to you. I know it has long been your desire that I marry. Are you finally come to your senses and wish to offer for Anne? She asked eagerly. No, Anne and I do not suit, he said decisively. In what way are you not a suitable match? In age, in fortune, in close relation? Everything of import, in short, you are excellently matched. But in affection we are not, he said. She is like a sister to me. Lady Catherine sighed. I suppose you wish to offer for your friend's sister, that Miss Bingley. She came to call upon me when I was in town. She possesses a most grating manner. At least she has some fortune, though it is derived from trade. No, the gentlewoman whom I wish to marry is the daughter of a landed gentleman, of no fortune, but possessing all other virtues that will reflect well on our family's character. Lady Catherine seemed caught between outrage that he would marry poor, and fascination at the personage thus described. Well, who is this penniless paragon? She demanded. Miss Elizabeth Bennet, Darcy said, glad to have come to the point. Lady Catherine rose with blazing eyes. Miss Elizabeth Bennet? That outspoken girl? Nearly no accomplishments, no governess, a family of daughters allowed to run wild? That Miss Elizabeth Bennet? She asked, outraged. I believe that we refer to the same lady, though I, of course, do not see her in the same light, he replied, attempting to keep himself calm. This country chit you would offer your hand? She demanded. I already have, and she has accepted me, he exaggerated unthinkingly. Of course she accepted you. What portionless farmer's daughter would not accept the master of Pemberley? Who can say what arts she employed to draw you in? But that you would contemplate such an action without consulting me, almost your nearest relation, much less make the offer. I am very disappointed in you, Fitzwilliam. I am sorry to disappoint you, aunt, he said, still in regulation of his temper, by a fraction. What are we coming to? She wailed, falling back into her seat. Who else would be a suitable spouse for Anne? And I suppose, as you are a confirmed romantic now, you will see Georgiana married to that Bingley fellow. If I am to be as consistent as I hope to be, I must allow Georgiana the discretion to make her own choice after she comes of age. Girls deciding on their own husbands? What has this country come to? She demanded of the heavens. Hopefully it will come to more domestic happiness, which has been in short supply for some time, he said. You are a romantic fool indeed if you think choosing one's spouse based on infatuation is the basis of happiness. You shall be ecstatic for the honeymoon, then suffer regrets for the rest of your life, if you persist in this madness. The girl is pretty enough, in that way that men find pleasing, but can you truly see her as mistress of Pemberley, as the woman that Georgiana will look to as her example of womanhood? It was an appreciation of how well she would do in both those capacities which decided me, he replied. Then you are headlong in infatuation, she said dourly. I ought to have insisted you marry Anne when you both came of age. You might have an heir by now if I had, one of unimpeachable ancestry. Aunt, how can you think? My cousin does not seem nearly hardy enough to bear children with ease. My humanity required me to consider that before my own feelings. We haven't had a childbed death in centuries, she declared. Will you never consider how my mother's health suffered after Georgiana's birth? He demanded, drawn into an old argument. She might have lived for a score more years if it weren't for your Derbyshire winters, she replied. Why do you not always come to visit for Christmas and stay until it is decently warm? I shall never understand. One of the downfalls of our age is that landowners spend their winters disporting themselves in town rather than minding their estates, he said, warming to his theme. Is it not enough that Georgiana stays here in the south each winter? And so you and Miss Bennet will take yourselves north to bring your tenants soup and mind them to not toil too hard, she asked belligerently. You describe our prospective domestic life most accurately, he said, anger making itself known in his tones. She waved him away, signaling her waiting woman to bring her a tonic. If you are determined, then away with you. Do not tire me with your stubbornness. My sister would be very disappointed. Would that I had the power to stop you from this ill-advised act. I hope that your opinion will change for the better as you make her acquaintance as Mrs. Darcy, he said. I will judge her as I find her, as I will you, nephew, she said with finality. He bowed and retired. Colonel Fitzwilliam had nearly reached the end of his powers of delay when Charlotte caught on and came to his aid with a series of observations upon the roads that served to keep them standing in the entryway until Darcy joined them. Ah, Darcy, Fitzwilliam said in relief. I was just going to show Mrs. Collins the new bulb sprouts. I believe you had something to discuss with Mr. Collins. With that, he made a hasty exit, Charlotte on his arm. Collins looked up at Darcy, greed and intimidation warring on his face. Darcy spoke quickly, before the vicar could gather himself into fresh sycophancy. Lady Catherine has just given me her blessing for my union with Miss Elizabeth Bennet, he said, hedging the truth greatly. Collins could scarce keep his feet for surprise. That such a low girl, so unseemly and portionless, not nearly as pretty as her older sister, would capture the attention of the great man, a man with more than one living in his gift. It was incomprehensible. He goggled at Darcy, dumbfounded. As she is staying in your family, she thought it right for me to ask you for permission to pay my addresses, he continued. Collins could scarcely agree quickly enough, and Darcy was disturbed to hear the amount of liberty the man was prepared to grant him. Darcy cut him off with a swift thanks, then made his way upstairs. He had many letters to write. Elizabeth paced the approach to the parsonage, awaiting the Collinses' return. Mr. Collins was first to appear, and seemed stunned. As he perceived her, he reeled slightly. Cousin Elizabeth, the most unexpected. You must be overjoyed. Such felicity as you could never have anticipated. Such a great man. I see that Mr. Darcy has spoken with you, she said, impatient of his rambling. Did you give him permission to pay his addresses? My dear cousin, his request was sanctioned by my patroness, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, his near relation. I would not delay to do so, he replied. Elizabeth suppressed a sigh of annoyance. Mr. Collins might very well have objected on the basis of the lack of her father's consent or mere pettiness on his part. Surely he did not wish to see her marry so high. She had hoped that the formidable aunt and stolid vicar would present a barrier, but it seemed Darcy had overborne them at once. You are feeling better? Your headache is quite gone? You are quite well? Collins asked anxiously. I am very well, she said, wishing he would go away so she could think. We ought to go inside. Night is near and the dew will be falling. We must mind your health, cousin. My dear Charlotte will join us soon. Elizabeth allowed him to escort her within, where she escaped to her room. Curses on the man! How dare he be so effective? She had imagined him approaching them while they were together, that they might support each other in persuading him how ill-advised the match was. Seeing him forced to break their attachment would be almost as satisfying as doing so herself. But the reunion of Jane and Mr. Bingley was not yet accomplished, so she must keep up the pretense.